The rain had been falling for nearly 3 hours when the woman stood outside the enormous iron gates of the Hawthorne estate, clutching a small suitcase with both hands and wondering if she had made the biggest mistake of her life. She had come to the house expecting a temporary job, a few difficult weeks caring for an elderly woman who had suffered a serious fall. She had not come looking for a family. She had not come looking for love. And she certainly had not come expecting that one day, years later, she would stand in the same doorway with tears streaming down her face, realizing that the house she had entered as a stranger had somehow become the only place she could call home. But on that stormy evening, she knew none of that. All she knew was that she desperately needed work, and the woman waiting inside desperately needed someone who cared. If you believe that kindness can change a person's life, that people sometimes arrive in our lives at exactly the moment we need them most, please take a moment to like this story, share it with someone who needs a little hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to Kindness Speaks. Your support helps us continue sharing stories about kindness, second chances, and the unexpected ways love can find us. Her name was Elena, though almost everyone in her life had stopped calling her anything except reliable. She was 32 years old, quiet by nature, with dark brown hair usually tied loosely behind her head and tired eyes that seemed older than they should have been. She had spent the last several years moving from one temporary caregiving job to another after losing the people who had once made her feel secure. Her father had died when she was 24, and 2 years later her mother passed away after a long illness. Elena had learned how to sit beside a hospital bed through the night, how to prepare medication schedules, how to recognize the difference between ordinary silence and the silence that meant something was wrong. She had also learned the cruel lesson that loving someone did not guarantee they would stay. The position at the Hawthorne estate had come through a local agency. The elderly woman needing care was Margaret Hawthorne, 78, a former literature professor whose husband had died almost a decade earlier. According to the agency, Margaret was recovering from a broken hip and had become increasingly dependent on others. Her only son, Daniel Hawthorne, was a successful architect who spent most of his time traveling between cities for work. He had hired several caregivers before Elena, but none had lasted more than a few weeks. When Elena arrived, she expected to see an elegant mansion filled with servants and expensive furniture. Instead, she found something strangely cold. The house was beautiful, but it felt empty. The walls were covered with photographs, yet the people in those photographs seemed frozen in another lifetime. There were pictures of Margaret as a young woman, Margaret with her husband, and a little boy with crooked glasses who Elena immediately recognized as Daniel. But there were surprisingly few recent photographs. Margaret was sitting beside a large window overlooking the rain-soaked garden. Her silver hair was neatly brushed, and a knitted blanket covered her legs. She studied Elena carefully before finally allowing the smallest smile to appear on her face. Elena introduced herself and explained that she was there to help with meals, medication, mobility, appointments, and whatever else Margaret needed. Margaret listened quietly and then said something Elena would remember for the rest of her life. She told her that she had interviewed many caregivers, but what she really wanted was someone who would treat her like a person instead of a responsibility. Elena understood immediately. During the first week, she worked carefully and professionally. She never invaded Margaret's privacy, never complained about the long hours, and never tried to force conversation. But Margaret noticed something unusual about her. Elena did not simply complete tasks. She paid attention. If Margaret's hands trembled while holding a cup, Elena quietly changed the cup. If Margaret became tired halfway through a story, Elena stopped whatever she was doing and listened anyway. If Margaret stared out the window for too long, Elena didn't ask unnecessary questions. She simply sat nearby. One afternoon, Margaret asked Elena why she was always so patient. Elena smiled sadly and said that patience was easier when you understood how quickly life could take something away. Margaret did not ask what she meant. Daniel returned home unexpectedly 3 weeks after Elena's arrival. He entered the house late at night carrying a leather briefcase, his coat damp from the rain. He was 39, tall, serious, and visibly exhausted. His reputation in the business world was impressive. He had designed buildings across the country and was known for demanding perfection from everyone around him. But when he walked into his mother's room and saw Elena helping Margaret arrange old photographs, his expression immediately hardened. He had expected another employee. Instead, he found a stranger sitting comfortably beside his mother as though she belonged there. Elena noticed his discomfort and immediately stood. She explained that she had only been helping Margaret organize the photographs because Margaret had asked. Daniel nodded politely but coldly. He thanked her for her work and then asked whether she intended to stay much longer. The question hurt more than Elena expected. She had never assumed she would stay forever. She was there because she needed employment. Still, something about the way he asked made her feel as though her presence was an inconvenience. She simply told him that she would remain as long as his mother needed her. Daniel replied that his mother had already become too dependent on caregivers. Elena looked at Margaret, then back at him. She gently reminded him that needing help was not the same thing as being helpless. Daniel said nothing. That night, he barely slept. Over the next few months, something unexpected happened. Margaret improved physically, but emotionally she became stronger than anyone had anticipated. She began walking short distances with Elena beside her. She started reading again. She asked Elena to bring flowers into the house. She even returned to her old habit of writing notes in the margins of books. And slowly, the house changed. The curtains were opened every morning. Music played in the kitchen. Fresh bread appeared on weekends. Margaret's laughter could sometimes be heard from the garden. Daniel noticed. He also noticed that his mother was happier whenever Elena was nearby. At first, he told himself that Elena was simply doing her job well. Then he began noticing smaller things. She remembered the exact way Margaret liked her tea. She knew which songs made her smile. She knew when Margaret needed encouragement and when she needed silence. But Daniel also noticed Elena's life outside the house seemed almost non-existent. She lived in a tiny rented apartment across town. She rarely took days off. She never bought anything for herself. Her clothing was simple and carefully maintained. When Margaret asked her what she wanted for her birthday, Elena jokingly said she wanted nothing. Margaret didn't believe her. One evening, she asked Elena to accompany her to the attic. There, among boxes of old books and photographs, Margaret found a small wooden jewelry box. Inside was a delicate silver necklace that had belonged to her late husband. She tried to give it to Elena. Elena refused. Margaret insisted. Elena finally accepted it, but only after promising she would wear it when she needed to remember that someone believed she deserved beautiful things. Daniel overheard the conversation from the hallway. For the first time, he realized that Elena was not simply caring for his mother. She was caring for everyone around her while quietly carrying her own loneliness. Winter arrived. One night, Margaret developed a severe fever. Elena stayed beside her for hours, monitoring her condition and calling the doctor. Daniel was away at a conference nearly 300 miles from home. Elena refused to leave Margaret alone. By dawn, Margaret's condition had stabilized. Daniel arrived that afternoon. He found Elena asleep in a chair beside his mother's bed, still wearing the same clothes she had worn the previous morning. Her hand rested near Margaret's, as though even in sleep she was making sure the older woman wasn't alone. Something inside Daniel shifted. He covered Elena with a blanket. She woke a few minutes later and immediately apologized for falling asleep. Daniel told her she had nothing to apologize for. It was the first genuinely gentle thing he had ever said to her. After that, their relationship slowly changed. Daniel began coming home more often. He started eating dinner with his mother. Sometimes Elena joined them. At first, their conversations were awkward, but eventually they became natural. Daniel learned about Elena's parents. He learned that she had once wanted to study interior design but abandoned that dream when her family needed her. Elena learned about Daniel's childhood, his father's strict expectations, and the guilt he carried because he believed he had failed his mother by building a career instead of staying home. Neither of them said the word love. Not yet. But something was growing. Then came the day everything nearly ended. Daniel received an offer to lead a major international project overseas. It was the kind of opportunity he had spent his entire career chasing. The position would require him to relocate for at least 2 years. He accepted. When he told Margaret, she became quiet. Elena heard the news later that evening. Daniel assumed she would congratulate him. Instead, she told him that if he was leaving, he needed to make proper arrangements for his mother. Daniel became defensive. He said his mother would have excellent medical care and that Elena could continue working if she wanted. Elena shook her head. She reminded him that she had come to care for Margaret, not to become a permanent replacement for a son. Daniel asked what she meant. Elena finally said the words that had been sitting inside her heart for months: she was only there to care for his mother. She never expected to become part of the family. Then she gave him her resignation. Margaret heard everything. The old woman was heartbroken. She told Elena that she had entered the house as a caregiver but had become her daughter in every way that mattered. Elena cried and held her, but she insisted that Margaret deserved a family member who could stay because she wanted to, not because she was being paid. The next morning, Elena packed her suitcase. She left the silver necklace on Margaret's bedside table. Margaret refused to let her go without it. Daniel stood at the bottom of the stairs watching Elena descend with her suitcase. He could have stopped her. But he was afraid. Afraid that if he asked her to stay, she would think he was offering her a job. Afraid that if he told her how much she meant to him, she would realize how vulnerable he had become. So he said nothing. Elena walked out. For 3 months, the Hawthorne house became silent again. Daniel left for his overseas project, but he could not concentrate. Every room reminded him of Elena. His mother's books were arranged the way Elena had arranged them. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the recipes she had taught the housekeeper. Even the garden seemed different without her walking through it. Margaret noticed her son's sadness. One evening, she finally told him that some people enter our lives as strangers because we are not ready to recognize them as family. Daniel understood. He returned home earlier than planned. He went to the small apartment where Elena was living, carrying no flowers, no expensive gifts, and no promises he wasn't sure he could keep. When Elena opened the door, she looked surprised. Daniel told her that he had spent years believing responsibility meant providing money, arranging doctors, paying bills, and solving problems. But he had finally understood that his mother didn't need another person to manage her life. She needed people who loved her. Then he admitted that he had been wrong about Elena. She had never been just a caregiver. She had become the person who taught him how to come home. Elena's eyes filled with tears. But she still asked him what he wanted from her. Daniel answered honestly. He didn't want another employee. He wanted a future. Not because his mother needed care. Not because the house was lonely. Not because he was afraid to be alone. Because somewhere between hospital nights, quiet dinners, rainy mornings, and countless ordinary moments, he had fallen in love with the woman who had never expected to stay. Elena didn't answer immediately. She looked at him for a long moment and then asked whether he was asking her to move back into the Hawthorne house. Daniel smiled and said that the house didn't matter. He wanted to build a home with her wherever she felt she belonged. For the first time in years, Elena allowed herself to believe that maybe she didn't have to keep leaving. She accepted his hand. A year later, Margaret celebrated her 80th birthday in the garden. There were flowers everywhere, music playing softly, and a long table filled with food. Daniel stood beside Elena while Margaret watched them from her chair, smiling with tears in her eyes. The house that had once felt cold was full of people. Children from the neighborhood played near the garden. Old friends came to visit Margaret. Daniel's colleagues arrived with gifts. Elena had finally begun studying interior design again, and she had transformed one unused room in the house into a small studio where she could work. Margaret watched Elena walk across the garden wearing the silver necklace. She smiled. The necklace had never been about jewelry. It had been about belonging. Years earlier, Elena had arrived at the Hawthorne estate carrying one small suitcase, convinced she was there temporarily. She believed that if she did her job well, she would leave quietly and continue her life somewhere else. She had been wrong. She had not stayed because Margaret needed a caregiver. She stayed because Margaret needed someone who would sit beside her when the world became frightening. She stayed because Daniel needed to learn that love could not be measured by a bank account or a successful career. And eventually, she stayed because she discovered something she had stopped believing existed. Home. Not a building. Not a surname. Not a perfect life. Home was the place where someone noticed when you were tired. Where someone remembered how you took your tea. Where your absence was felt. Where you could put down your suitcase and finally stop preparing to leave. Years later, when Margaret was asked how Elena had become part of the family, she simply smiled and said that Elena had arrived to care for her motherly heart, but somewhere along the way, all three of them learned how to care for one another. And perhaps that was the greatest surprise of all. Sometimes we enter someone's life thinking we are there to help them. Only later do we realize that they were quietly helping us, too. If this story touched your heart, please don't let it end here. Like the video, share it with someone who believes that kindness still matters, and subscribe to Kindness Speaks. Every comment, every share, and every subscription helps these stories reach someone who may need a little hope today. And before we end, I have one special request for you. Comment, "I believe kindness can become home," if you believe that the right people can enter our lives unexpectedly and change everything. I would love to know how many of you still believe that love, kindness, and second chances can find us when we least expect them. Because sometimes, the people we think are only passing through are the very people who were meant to stay.